So I'm in the middle of organizing my business plan for the year. I've run the numbers. Patreon or a similar subscription platform like Substack is far and away the best business model by the numbers. However, when I go online and research articles about how authors should use Patreon or Substack, again and again I found the same advice. Don't think about Patreon or Substack, etc., as a primary source of income. So am I wrong or are they wrong? I'm going to dive into what I do when I'm looking at starting a business, specifically a business of being a new indie author, and everyone tells me I'm wrong. So the first thing I do when people tell me I'm wrong is usually second guess myself, probably to an unhealthy extent. But it is good to go re-examine your assumptions and see if you're missing anything. So I did a sanity check in a few different formats. So one, just as a business coach, the first thing I ask is, do people want what I have to sell? Are people paying for it? And yes, people are paying for entertainment subscriptions of all kinds, from, you know, the big Netflix everywhere movies type of thing down to Patreons and subscription Substacks for particular authors. So yeah, it's a service that people want and people are making a full-time living at. And that's kind of the second question I asked myself, has somebody done this? And I found several examples of authors, for instance, who, not just famous authors, but authors who started writing and just putting up their stuff behind a paywall, or like putting up some of it for free and then doing a time lapse to a paywall, etc. There's this is alive and well. I found examples. One of those examples is someone who doesn't have a monthly fee but gets $8,000 per chapter. And has released 150 chapters, probably not all at $8,000, but you can quickly see, like, money can be made here. It's not impossible. There is a question of how likely it should be. The last thing I do is look for the actual customers. What are they saying? And there's some good news and bad news here. I mean, there's plenty of people who support artists, and the top reasons are they just want to support that person's work, and either they just like giving back after they've received something and they have the means to do so, or they like getting short stories or whatever other people aren't getting. Interestingly, some people specifically don't like the additional short stories because they think it distracts from the same the main work of an author. But there's also a lot of people, this is especially true of the Royal Road, like web serial route, where people will pay to be chapters ahead, to read chapters ahead. And a very common comment was that basically people will subscribe for a short time to catch up on a story arc and then maybe cycle their subscriptions, although for a favorite author they tend to stick the whole time, so and tend to want to support them and just do an annual subscription if they have the means. And of course there's people who don't have the means, and that's okay. So if at every level of this sanity check I am getting a response that yes, it is possible to make a full-time income from Patreon, then why are people saying it's not? And I think just as important as examining my own assumptions, it is so helpful to start picking apart the assumptions of people who think things are not possible. Because very often what happens is there's something they think is a constraint, like you have to do it this way, and maybe if you can release those constraints, you open up possibilities that they can't see. So this is a helpful exercise. So I dived into, like, what are the arguments against using Patreon as a full-time income source? So the first complaint against Patreon as a full-time income is that you can't do it unless you're famous. Like, you're not gonna get enough people signed up to your Patreon unless you're so famous you're making more money somewhere else. This is an interesting one. There are several case examples against this, right? So one is an earlier one I cited of an author who just started putting out chapters online and then built up enough following to make a full-time living from doing that. And obviously they built things up from scratch. So, like, yes, would it have been faster if they'd already been famous to get that following? Sure. But is there a path to building that following? Also, sure. So that's a counter against it. And another interesting one is N.K. Jemisin, a well-known famous author who actually used it initially she wasn't making enough money from books, and so she used Patreon as a way to fill out her income and quit her day job, and then still uses it as a supplemental income. But what that tells me actually is that the traditional way of marketing doesn't pay you enough to make money, and Patreon is more likely to give you the money you need to find independence than traditional publishing, like that example. So this idea that you have to be a famous author first, I would say like N.K. Jemisin's case strongly refutes that. Now, is it helpful? I'm sure N.K. Jemisin found followers a lot faster because she had exposure. She has fantastic books that I am a fan of, and so I'm sure that made things easier for her. But I find it really interesting that she couldn't find, even though she was award-winning, she couldn't find economic freedom in the traditional route. And if you want to know why, check out my numbers video at the where I go through the business model, traditional publishing, self-publishing, and subscription, and I'll show you why there's such a difference and why someone like N.K. Jemisin, who's award-winning, would have a problem making ends meet just with traditional publishing, and why a subscription platform was able to free her. Like, once you look at the business models, it's so clear why that would work. So there's a lot of strong counterexamples of that, even with people who are famous, right? And I think that the underlying assumption here is just, yes, it would be like, it would take so long, or it'd be so hard to do this yourself. And I don't disagree, absolutely will. But it's hard anyway. It's hard to get your first book published. It's hard to get famous in the first place. So if you're starting from square one, I wouldn't assume that you have to get famous before you can do these things. That's just adding extra hurdles and extra assumptions, right? And so when you pick apart this argument, like, yeah, if I were famous, would it be faster to build a Patreon? Sure. But since I'm not famous, would it be faster for me to get get traditionally published and become famous, and then start a Patreon, and then still have to start a Patreon to make a full-time living from writing? Or should I just build up my content online and start attracting people now? Whereas, you know, instead of needing a large back catalog, I might only need to just start writing one chapter at a time, which is going to get you a following faster. There are so many reasons why the actual starting like one chapter at a time as a web serial, we'll talk about that later, that does have its own problems, or like testing bits of content online now is so much faster than writing a freaking novel, going through the review process multiple times in private, releasing to the public, and then seeing what they think about it, versus like being able to release a chapter and see what people think about it immediately. Wow, like that second is going to be so much faster. So issue number 2, why people think Patreon should not be a full-time income. Patreon does not provide value. It provides all kinds of values, is what I would say. I would say their assumption is it doesn't provide more value than a book because it's more expensive than a book, right? So like the value proposition, if I subscribe to someone who releases a book over the period of a year and I paid $80 for that subscription versus someone who just like picks up the book later and does, you know, for at $15 or something like that, I've paid you know, more than 5 times as much for that. Would be kind of, that argument is just like, it's a ripoff. So I think I am sensitive to this, but I also know how much this ignores. There are several additional value propositions that you can add or that are baked into Patreon above and beyond the book. It's not just about the book. And if you only see the book, it's just Patreon's probably not targeted at you, as some avid patrons were saying to somebody who was making this point. They were actually arguing, these are people who pay for Patreon, who's like, no, you don't get it. You don't get why we do this. So one of them I mentioned is just access to famous people. But if you're a newer indie author, you don't really have that. You can be access to a creative person or like access to a creator, and if they like your content, they might want that access anyway. They might still appreciate that, but like, yeah, your value is not going to be the same as someone as N.K. Jemisin's in that that category. But there are others, right? You can release things in formats that are not easily put in a book, like multimedia or other things. So you have more flexibility. This is good or bad. If you just want to write, you're probably not going to use, you know, that would be a distraction for you. If you're kind of like me, who's interested in the whole videos or programming or other things, like maybe doing a visual novel, etc., I think it might be fun to try that out, and we'll see whether people like that or not. Future videos coming up. So it gives you more flexibility. You can offer more than just a book. So that idea that, you know, it's that you're comparing apples to oranges is not quite fair, even just in terms of like content that you're delivering. But above and beyond the content, there is group membership. So there is a value to belonging to a group that has similar interests. And I have seen the difference in my own life between free public groups that are just full of spam and noise and people who aren't really invested in like low-level engagement and blah, versus paid groups do tend to be people who are more committed, more interested, higher engaged, more likely to be interesting and active in doing things in that community, versus like people who just kind of doom scroll and, you know, joined your group for free. And so there's a huge difference, you know, in the quality of community. Patreon doesn't necessarily take advantage of that, but it can. That is a big time investment. It is something I'm thinking about. I like groups. I want contact with my audience. So that is something that I do want to bake in, and I'm trying to figure out how to make that manageable. But that's something a novel does not give you. And that's something Netflix or, you know, another big subscription service that offers a lot more content can give you. They can't give you community and that experience. So there's community value. There is brand value. So I mean, if you take a look at jeans, like, you know, designer jeans, is the value in the extra value of designer jeans, that like the jeans are so much better. Like, Levi's are better than a lot of knockoff pairs in terms of they tend to last a little bit longer for me. Like, there's some quality up to Levi's, but like Levi's isn't your super expensive name brand. But when you get up to the really expensive name brands, it's like what they're selling is identity. That's what good branding is. And that's actually what a lot of people are openly paying for. When they say, I like giving my creator a tip, or I like helping them continue to create, what they like about that is they like how they feel about themselves and how they see themselves when they help somebody else. And like, yes, that should not be your only value. I don't wear fancy name brand jeans, but there are people who like that identity. I think being a patron is a much cooler identity. Like, I would and am and have been a patron, like Kickstarter supporter, etc. I do not buy designer jeans, right? I like that identity, and that identity is not nothing. Like, there is a value. It kind of feels a little squishy, and it feels, I think sometimes for some creators, like it's an issue of pride. Like, I don't want to have to rely on other people for my income, but like, you're doing that no matter what. Yeah, it's okay to rely on other people, and it's okay that people give you money because they like supporting you. But I think a lot, to put fears of creators at rest who kind of do, and I do feel that like sting of pride, like, it feels like begging for money. You know, it's so much more expensive than a book. I think the other thing that is uniquely valuable about Patreons when to patrons when I look through their words is really they find something that hits the right niche. And so it's like, yes, Netflix can offer you hundreds of titles that aren't exactly what you want, and you could spend, you know, minutes scrolling through videos. Have you ever done that? Like, scrolled through videos and eventually just decided, like, on Netflix that you were like so bored you just like watch something on YouTube instead, right? Because there's nothing that was a perfect fit. And so, like, you're not gonna be a perfect fit for everyone. Don't try to be a perfect fit for everyone, but find someone who really likes what you do. Like, find the audience that really likes what you do and let them immerse themselves in it. And, like, the ability to regularly go to a place where you're giving them content. If they like multiple types of content and you like producing it, they're doing, you know, they're getting that. They're getting maps and letters from the characters or whatever, right? Creative additional content. They're getting illustrations from the author or like teaser trailers, all that kind of stuff. You know, they're not only getting that from you, but they're also getting that from the community. And so that's something you can offer that a generalized mass market subscription can't. And so that is kind of putting this to rest, right? And I think the underlying assumption that I'm debunking there is all you're providing in Patreon is just the book. But this kind of leads into the third criticism, which is Patreon, or whatever, name your subscription platform, Substack, etc., is a distraction from your real work. And there is some teeth to this, right? I just said you're offering more than the book, right? Which is why people subscribe. Asterisk. So the top reasons why people subscribe to to be patrons of their favorite artists or authors is one, they like the content, so they want to support the author, and like two, they like getting the content earlier or special content, etc. It's not even the Q&A so much. And so really, the value proposition is the content. Creating content that people love and want more of, right? You're not gonna get patrons without that. Of course, you're not gonna sell books without that. You're not gonna be successful anywhere without that. And so I think this is a little bit like the fame concern, which is like, oh yeah, like content needs to be first no matter what you do. Anyway, the underlying assumption I think here is that it has to be a distraction versus designing your Patreon strategically to build your book and also build your marketing materials. I think you can do both of those things. I am going to talk about that a lot more in a future video where I dive into how people are actually using Patreon and, you know, what seems to work or what not. But I just wanted to let you know that sometimes when everyone tells you you're crazy, it's just because they're making assumptions that aren't true. And if you don't follow their assumptions, you may find opportunities that they are completely blind to. So, and this is one where that Patreon should not be thought of as a full-time income. I think people are wrong on this, and you will see whether I succeed or I crash and burn. That is the excitement of this channel, so stay tuned, subscribe if that's your thing. But if you're curious about why I am so convinced that the subscription platform is a better business model and worth figuring out, even if it takes some time to get right, go ahead and check out my video on how to start from scratch as an indie author in 2024, where I go over the different business models, and you will see why it's worth giving subscription a shot first. See you next time on the Ubiquitous Tavern.